Even the most dedicated and loyal fans can have apprehension when a studio goes a new direction with their work. What's the old saying? If it ain't broke, don't fix it? Here's the thing about that though. It doesn't necessarily hold true when it comes to the world of art and the world of video games, even if you see yet another Madden release from EA. Granted, that decision always holds a risk, as sometimes a studio will be given new life thanks to a decision to overhaul a game's style, like the Resident Evil 2 remake. While sometimes, a franchise may be buried with some tweaks to its core genre, like in Wolfenstein Youngblood. Those subscribers of this channel know that I love all things Danganronpa. I mean, it's two of the highest scoring games that I've reviewed, and even the spin-off did pretty well in my eyes. But to see the team go in a completely new direction was scary, especially when they were tackling a genre that I hadn't exactly had the greatest of luck in the dungeon crawler RPG genre, with games scoring poorly like Vaporeum and Stranger of Sword City, which yes, I still have nightmares about. Zanki Zero: Last Beginning came out on April 9th, 2019 on the PlayStation 4 and the PC, specifically Steam, and cost $59.99. It's developed and published by Spike Chunsoft, and many of the members of the Danganronpa team worked on the game. It's a game that is also sort of a spiritual successor to the series in some sense, but way off into a whole new area in another. It was the game I was looking to most in 2019 due to my love of the Danganronpa series, love of character development, those wonderful, wonderful twists, and it being something different in a game world where people sort of follow the leader. Now, 4 months after launch, I finally beat the game. I've been busy, alright? With over 90 hours put into the game on the main playthrough, not including the New Game Plus mode, which I put some time into as well. One note before I begin this review. As with all of my reviews, I'll do my best to not spoil anything significant to the enjoyment of picking up the game. However, in this case, there are elements of Zanki Zero that I would love to discuss plot-wise with other people. So, come join the Discord channel and I'll talk the game up and down. Cause if you've probably seen the runtime of this video, I have a lot to say about the game. While there's a lot more to the gameplay from the Danganronpa team this time around, that's not exactly what I was looking forward to the most with Zanki Zero. It was, of course, the story. The game starts off simply. Haruto Higurashi is contemplating suicide. As you'll find out later, life hasn't exactly worked out well for him, so he decides to throw himself off a building. It doesn't exactly work out as expected, however, as Haruto wakes up on a remote island. A little strange, but what's stranger still is what he exactly wakes up to. The absolute collapse of the civilized world. Yes, that's right, the world has basically ended, with the exception of Haruto and the 7 other main characters. As you'll learn, 7 of them represent a particular sin, while the 8th is sort of a mystery character. Haruto is the editor of Sloth, for example, who is a stereotypical salaryman persona, but ends up being the de facto leader of the group due to his level-headed nature. Let's meet our other main characters. First, you've got the Florist of Lust, Rinko Susukino, a kind-hearted, nervous, yet strong-willed lady who is presented as slightly naive. You've got the emotionally cold Zen Kubota, a farmer of wrath who takes cynicism to a whole new level throughout the story, but is much like an onion, extremely layered. Next, we've got the Artist of Envy, Ryo Mikajimi, a bondage artist who loves his rope and tying things up, and acts somewhat as a comic relief yet nervous individual, yet as I'll reveal later on, has a lot more complexity than meets the eye. Fifth is Minamo Satoshi, the Officer of Pride, who's cheerful, lighthearted, and has a strong sense of justice. Think Amelia from Slayers. The Heiress of Gluttony is Yuma Masahiro, who is the daughter of the famous Masahiro group in the game, and is princess-like in many ways, and yet something under the surface exists that no one can see. Then you've got the bodybuilder-doctor of greed, Mamoru Ichio, who is all about the love, and yet seems to be a weird combination of emotion and professionalism. Finally, we've got Sachika, who is a little bit special compared to everyone else, having robotic limbs and not having a sin associated with her that's presented to you at the start of the game. The 8 survivors must now figure out a way to survive the end of the world. But things aren't even as simple as the world is ending, unfortunately for them. As the trailers have shown, the characters are all clones, with a 2-week lifespan in most cases. That's right, they only have 2 weeks to live. But don't worry about them. They can just reclone themselves thanks to the X keys in their belly button, which retains their memories and experiences even after they die. Now, this isn't your typical cloning process, however, as the characters do start as young children when cloned, thanks to the cloning machine, aka the Extend machine, and they age rapidly during a 2-week process. There is an exception to this in Sachika, who doesn't age at all and doesn't die after 2 weeks, leaving to confusion on why she's so special. But the crew is pointed to a possible solution by the mysterious Extend TV and segments to help repair the Extend machine, hoping to fix elements of the machine to perfect the cloning process and get rid of that nasty aging problem, as well as some other issues. But alas, it's not so simple. Each part is in a ruin that's symbolic of a key time of one of the protagonists' life, and in those ruins are creatures such as giant crabs.
So here's this giant enemy crab.
And creatures infected by Cleone, a sort of symbiotic parasite relationship that powers up the creatures they have infected. Our protagonists must fight their way through the ruins, beat the boss that guards the piece of the Extend machine, and hopefully live to see another day. However, for a game about the future of humanity, the story for a good part of it focuses on our protagonists, finding out about their past, about some of the sins and troubles they've gone through, and trying to piece together who they were, as some amnesia is present here. There's a lot of questions set up at the start of the game. Why the 8 are the ones that are alive at the end of the world? What exactly led to the circumstances of the monsters and the cloning machines? And why there's this mysterious feeling that they all know each other before this. With those basics of the story out of the way, let me talk about the story's strengths. The characters. This shouldn't be surprising. This is by the Danganronpa team, which have some of the best characters in modern-day video games in my opinion, with those like Chihiro, Nagato, and Kokichi Oma. But the reason why Zanki Zero's characters are so fascinating is several-fold. First of all, the writing's mastery of using typical stereotypes and yet twisting elements of them to add complexity to their personalities is one of the big reasons. Take Yuma, for example, who falls into that princess-type category, and yet she's hefty and is obsessed with food. Yes, I know Fat Princess was a game, and yes, that is present in some other games, but considering all the other princess types you see here, she stands out a bit uniquely. But that's just on the surface, as many of the princess stereotype characters in modern literature end up having a revelation that they need to be more involved and change their hands-off ways, willing to get dirty. Yuma, on the other hand, embraces her role as someone who's hands-off, as an overseer of sorts, as revealed in some of her interactions with characters, in particular with the romance portion. The game doesn't apologize for some of the weaknesses of their characters or their darker sides, but they realize that that's part of the character as a whole and can be a positive in certain situations. Of course, there are certain elements of a character that will grow and learn from the experience, but it feels like a lot of games, especially nowadays, aren't willing to see the brighter side of certain negative personality traits, and yet Zanki Zero embraces this directly. A majority of the ruins puts one of the characters in the spotlight, and you will take control of a different character at the start of each chapter. One of the game's other strengths in storytelling is the layers of each character, as you begin to peel the layer of the character back, revealing the supposed sin that they had to deal with through the series of vignettes on the Extend TV. These character sub-stories serve as great side stories, but I'm going to be honest here, they are the highlight of the storytelling as a whole. Showing each character and how they deal with the informations that the others may learn is fascinating to watch, as they all have different reactions to it. Some of them are willing to show it openly, some of them will not, some of them will do whatever it takes to make sure that others don't see it. These stories are compelling, and can get dark as well. If you were afraid that Spike Chunsoft and the Danganronpa team were going to go a little bit softer in this new series, you'd be entirely wrong on that front. These characters have very complicated and dark pasts, and you may get uncomfortable at certain points of the game with what happens. And that's what you should expect out of a game like this. In addition, I like that the characters actually have conflict, yet brotherhood within each other. Yes, the world has ended, and they all should get along, but we know better than that. The actual interactions between characters feel appropriate to their stance and the information that they have at the time, as they aren't going to just trust each other from the get-go, but are also willing to listen, and they understand that they need each other to survive the situation. It does help that our main protagonists are characters that I all liked. All of them had some element that was intriguing, and each character interacting with another had a certain dynamic to it and wasn't just generic as a whole. Sure, certain pairs would pop up in interaction and be focused on, but it's not like that one would dominate the story for a long period of time. So you may be asking who my favorite character of the game was. To be honest, it's a tough one. I went back and forth on several characters, my top 3 being Yuma, Zen, and my final choice. It's hard because the game wants you to think of everyone as a group for the most part, but I may shock people with my choice for those who at least played the game. My choice is Ryo. Ryo, who you could try to archetype as the comic relief role, which is one that usually wears on me very quickly. However, his backstory and his fascination with bondage was something that felt really earnest and raw with his character. And I like that I could really see his character's weaknesses come out in a lot of the interactions between others. His backstory is the best one in my opinion, because it feels so different from everything else that I have seen before. Yeah, of course, all the other ones are interesting too, but this one stuck with me. This is when the game almost went to another level, which was surprising for me. I expected this character to be the one that I didn't like the most, and yet here I am, liking him the most. Speaking of which, there is a relationship portion of the game that plays out, and considering that the world is ending, these protagonists aren't exactly picky. You build up each relationship to 4 different levels within gameplay, and each have a unique side story between them that feels reasonable for the 2 characters in question, regardless of gender. To the point where you will actually get a scene of them in bed. And well, the first time this can happen can be a little bit interesting. Needless to say, I did not expect the second time for me to get a cutscene on this to see an interaction with a buff Mamoru in nothing but boxers in bed. I'm just going to leave this on the screen for a couple of seconds just to let you soak it in. Also, just to be clear, ages play a part in this game too, with the exception of children in this portion, so thank God for that. Getting back to the main story, however, there is a detective part of the game, as I mentioned before. The fact is, you don't know where you are, what happened to the world, and a good amount of that is intriguing, but it's more straightforward than Spike Chunsoft's, and in particular, the Danganronpa team's other works. This is where you can see the influence from the Danganronpa series in the game, despite the fact that it's not really a successor to the series, more like a spiritual successor. For example, the game establishes early on that one of the characters may not be working with you directly, but even that information is suspect when it comes to the Extend TV, and you'll be questioning it throughout the game. The game's dual element of dealing with that and the overall survival plot are woven well together enough, even though you really do care more about the smaller characters' sub-stories than the actual mystery of why the world died to a certain point. Yeah, you're interested, but you're sort of sucked in by the sub-stories more than anything else. Actually, as a sort of side note, I do want to touch on the localization rather briefly here. I know there have been concerns regarding Spike Chunsoft games, and in particular games published by NIS America, which this game is self-published, so there shouldn't be a problem here. There have been concerns about localization in terms of inserting political elements that don't seem to make sense to certain people. Now, I myself did not have that opinion. I do think things like references to Trump, for example, made sense for the kind of content that it was going for. Now, Zanki Zero, on the other hand, there is no sort of political, social, economical element when it comes to localization. There are Americanized versions of jokes, however, in particular references like Beyonce. Yes, they could be a little bit off-putting when you know that this is a Japanese game at heart, but I feel like they still capture the moments in question. The fact is, it's supposed to be a celebrity that is a little bit popular, and, well, they're supposed to look up to. And yes, it makes sense for when it's used. Still a little bit shocking, however, when it actually is used. The weakest part of the story, in my opinion, is actually the last third of the game. I'm not gonna lie. If the game would have ended a chapter or two earlier, it might have worked better in the long run. And let me be clear, it's not saying that the ending that we did get doesn't have strong emotional elements, or that it isn't a satisfying ending in some ways. The fact is that by the end credits, yes, I did appreciate the ending sequence. But it just felt like a different level from everything else in the wrong direction. When one of the mid-game plot points is revealed in Zanki Zero, the game at that point lost a bit of momentum from the story perspective at that 2/3 portion of the game. In essence, the antagonist of the game up to that point somewhat changes in a way. And I don't want to spoil anything, but the replacement for it is a bit weak. That's despite the fact it could have done a lot to send the game into a really interesting direction. The new antagonist feels almost forced at the end of the game, and quite frankly, part of me wonders if it was added after the fact, because it just seems so disconnected from everything else. But it's in combination with another plot point that just plain doesn't get resolved by the end game that really sort of sours me towards the last third. Yeah, I understand, certain plot points won't always get resolved in games, but you think central ones would. This one in particular drove a good amount of the game forward, and for it to not show up in any sort of significant way at the end, I really did feel disheartened by. Finally, the game can also stretch out certain storylines and introduce plot points to almost force in elements to justify certain reveals later in the game, to the point where it actually hurts the flow of the game, and I wonder if one whole side gameplay mechanic was added just for that twist and twist alone for the plot point. It does sort of negatively impact the overall oomph of some of the ending, and again, it feels like it was just sort of put in there at the last minute. Nevertheless, the story is fantastic in Zanki Zero, even if it ends a little bit, not badly, but a little bit in a disappointing section of things. Great characters, some great twists, and some very, very subtle yet fantastic hints about the plot are embedded within the overall story. and that's what you could expect from the Spike Chunsoft team and the Danganronpa team. So, no real complaints here. Well, yes, complaints, but you know what I mean. For some, the gameplay was going to be what was going to make or break whether or not Zanki Zero was going to succeed. And it being a grid-based dungeon crawler caused me to pause it first. Again, I want more people to experience the stories of things like Danganronpa, and while I do appreciate that they've made a mashup of that kind of story, more or less, and gameplay, dungeon crawlers haven't exactly been my favorite genre, well, at least the ones that I've played lately. But I'm happy to say that Zanki Zero did not follow the channel's history, and it's the best dungeon crawler that I've played in the modern day video game era. Zanki Zero's main gameplay mechanic involves making your way through a series of ruins to find a part for the extend machine, to give it new functionality, and hopefully find a way to not die every couple of weeks. You do this by moving in a grid-like fashion in real time, able to turn your body 90 degrees and move all 4 cardinal directions even if you're not facing that direction. You have 2 main general attacks, a single light attack that starts a cooldown timer and moves you to the next ready character in your group of 4. You also can hold and charge your attack for more powerful damage with the rest of your group if you so want. A little bit into the game, you also get to assign one offensive skill with a Cleone, which can launch anything from a devastating blunt attack that can break walls, to an area of effect acid attack that can burn through certain enemies. You also have the ability to use a healing Cleone, but I'm going to be honest here, I didn't use it for most of the game, but more on that later. Direction is key in the game. Enemies even in front of you can hit from a certain side, and your team's layout and the direction they are facing is rather important. If they attack you from the front with a right-handed attack, for example, it'll hit the leftmost front person in your party. Usually you'll want your guys who can take the hits up in the front, and maybe your weaker or maybe ranged party members in the back. What I do appreciate here is that it was always clear where the attack was hitting from and why it was hitting a certain individual, which in some games of the genre was an actual problem. Now, this isn't true entirely, but the one enemy type that I can think of where that's not the case, there's a reason for that because they're supposed to sneak up on you, sort of like a ninja. The basic combat is pretty straightforward and simple. Move yourself out of the way of enemy attacks, then get in and hit a series of attacks without getting hit, and repeat the process. Now, there is a weak point to hit on enemies that can disable certain parts, which could stagger certain enemies or leave them without particular attacks. But the base of all the combat is about that timing. Each enemy has their own attack range, movement patterns, and speed when it comes to attack you, and learning them is vitally important to surviving at harder difficulties. And the timing is all of that. Getting in, getting out, not taking that brutal hit, yeah, that's what this game is all about. And before you say, well, I'll just play the game on an easier setting and not have to worry about that, it's not that simple when it comes to Zanki Zero, especially if you're a completionist. Enemy variety in terms of attacks is good, as the game changes things up reasonably with each set of ruins, and in particular keeps things fresh with the level layout that switches between some presets, even after you come back to a dungeon, and enemy movement patterns. One of the reasons why this game stands out compared to other dungeon crawlers, however, is simple. Even after learning enemy patterns, even after learning how the game worked, at higher difficulties, I still was missing and getting myself into trouble in combat despite how simple it looked at the surface, while still feeling like I was in charge of things. Zanki Zero understood the KISS principle, but made it so that the simplicity wasn't necessarily straightforward at times. Dungeons being compact in certain ways with specific enemy type combinations caused new stresses and issues for you in conjunction with the traps that were present, or gave you new options with those traps present. Also, now that I've mentioned it, the dungeons are actually a threat too, with switches that can activate traps, and even when paying attention to them, you could accidentally end up causing a problem for yourself with them, thanks to the wise decision of not separating the traps from enemies like I see so many games in the genre seemingly do. You do still have puzzle sections, of course, but I do like how the exploration elements do play a part in the game, and that you can't just focus on one, because if you were sitting there trying to figure out how to get through this part, and you're not paying attention to the enemy that's charging at you, well, you're gonna die, and there's actually threats that could cause you to make a mistake. Granted, it's not the best in the genre at this. There are some traps that can feel like you really needed clairvoyance in order to avoid them. And in particular, yeah, there's probably a solution you could find, but not after you've tried one or two of the traps in question and your team has been wiped out because you're playing on a high difficulty. Elaborating on the difficulty, there are 5 difficulties in the game that are Roman numeraled, ranging from really easy to extremely difficult, and you can change it at the base of operations on Garage Island. However, there's a catch here. Your difficulty choice determines several things. Of course, how much damage enemies do to you, but it's more than that. The experience you earn, the drops you can get and the rate, the drop types you can get, and the Kione you can pick up off enemies. All are elements of the difficulty system. Certain items do not show up for upgrades at lower difficulties, and there are reasons to switch between them, especially at certain parts of the game. These difficulties aren't small adjustments either. Switch to the highest difficulty, and you can frankly have your team be one-shot by enemies even at reasonably high stats. I really liked how even at the end game, I was using the smaller difficulties to search around for certain rooms that I hadn't found, but then went back to other areas at higher difficulties to get better parts for my equipment. It's one of the first games that I can think of in the modern era that use difficulty as a tool for a person to go further, not just for the challenge's sake, but an actual mechanic in the game that made it a little bit of sense in the world, if that makes sense. But okay, you're probably saying to yourself, Dragnix, this sounds like pretty much all other dungeon crawlers in its base element. Yeah, the difficulty may be different, but you have difficulty options in other games. What makes Zanki 0 different than other dungeon crawlers out there? There's actually several elements to that, but let's start with one of the big ones, the aging mechanic. As mentioned before, clones can live basically up to 2 weeks, but during that time, they will age. Each clone will start as a child, move up to adulthood, then middle-aged, then a senior. The key here is that each age group has its own strengths and weaknesses that characters can take advantage of, especially based on their skill set. For example, adults and middle-aged are better attackers and defenders, while children will heal faster out of battle. Everything is affected by your age, and you'll have to juggle when to take out certain areas depending on your crew, especially because you can die from old age. Having to juggle your crew, who's aged what right now, who could take a hit or two, if you should push on with the story or just go and grind so you can get the right combination of ages, is a big part of the experience, and one that makes you plan and think your runs out a little bit. This is of course in conjunction with the other major mechanic that the game uses, death. Of course, every RPG, dungeon crawler, hardcore Fire Emblem game, all of them have death involved. But at a certain point in those games, death is just something that happens. You get over it, you deal with it, but it's almost like a non-factor if you can play around it. Zanki 0, death is something that you have to plan around and in fact use to your advantage. So, like, take for example, you have a crew of 8 people in your party, but you can only use 4 at a time. If one of your characters die in a dungeon, you don't have that many people to take over their spot, especially if they are not putting in the same effort as the person before. They may not be the right age, the right build type, the right weapon type, so on and so forth. However, that's not where it ends. A party member who dies transforms into dust, meaning that their equipment, their items, drop to the ground at that specific spot. Now you're left with a choice. Do you leave the items at that spot, hoping to come back with the party member to get them equipped again? Or do you grab as much as you can with the limited item spots and the limited weight elements of your party, maybe weighing them down, causing them more stress and making them more susceptible to death? At what point do multiple deaths and items do you just say, screw a run and get out there? What point do you actually leave some of that medicine that you could need later on, but you hope that you just don't need right now? It makes you question every move with a death. Do I push harder in the dungeon? Do I have trouble getting back here? And it's fascinating, and it was throughout the game. But what if I told you that sometimes death may help you get over the hurdle of a boss or a dungeon? That'd be crazy, right? Well, not with the game's Shigabane feature. See, remember how I said memories and experiences of an X-key are kept on the death of a clone? Well, that applies to their combat efficiency as well, as the way they die is important to their growth. Okay, so let's say one of your characters are taken out by a slashing blade attack. When you resurrect that character, you can choose to pay a little more to res them with their Shigabanes. Then you'll find they're more resistant against slash attacks because of that death, or able to carry more if they died overburdened with weight, or even increase defense if they had a big life event. What's awesome here is that there are tons of these Shigabanes throughout the game for each character, and some of them come at a reasonable surprise and are reasonably specific. Get locked in a corner where you only have one way you can go, and you die? That's a Shigabane. Get launched by a ramp off the side of a map and have all 4 of your characters drown as a result? Well, that's a Shigabane, and they'll be protected the next time around from it. And that's awesome. It's sort of like collecting Pokemon, except with collecting deaths. Actually, on that note, let's change gears a little bit here, because it's not all about combat and exploration. The second big part of Zanki Zero is the actual survival and upgrading your home aspect of the game. Each character has a set of stats you've got to take care of. Their health, their stamina, their bladder, their happiness. Each having consequences if you don't take care of them. You'll have to eat, use the bathroom, drink water, all those things that are sort of necessary to survive on a day-to-day basis. And they have consequences if you don't pay attention. For example, if a character ends up going over their bladder limit during your investigations, they don't die like you see in other games, but they do actually pee themselves, which basically stops them from attacking for a period of time. And that can be really, really bad if you're in the middle of a fight and you don't have another person to switch them out for. A lot of the survival elements are influenced by your main garage, aka Garage Island, where you'll be able to build facilities that let you make better food, more powerful weapons that do more damage, a toilet to relieve oneself, and some dorms to get some rest and emotionally connect with your teammates, and some facilities to store your extra items, which, yes, there's a huge need in this game for that. Survival elements of the game do enough to cause you headaches, but are manageable with the right inventory and character care. It does enough to not be an overburden to the game where it gets so ridiculous that you just don't want to play anymore, which a lot of survival games are like that for me. But it's more like thorns in the ground. If you don't pay attention, you're going to get hurt and it's going to cause you a lot of problems. But it is a great system, which brings me to my next big point. The strongest element of this game, the reason why it is one of the best dungeon crawlers I've played in a long while, is the balance of all the aforementioned systems and how they work with each other. Things like the inventory limit give you enough room to carry significant items you need on your journey, but not enough room where you can carry everything and be able to take on every scenario. It would have been so easy for the developers to add an inventory boosting item to the game, but the fact that Zanki Zero kept with a small inventory meant that those big decisions still played big parts at the end of the game, even when you got a handle of it. The circle of gameplay in this game is fascinating to see at a 30,000 feet basis, because it's like a perfectly woven spider web. You pull on one string, everything else moves with it, And that is what I've always said is the best sort of game design. For a team known for more story-based experiences, this impressed me. And it impressed me in such a level that I honestly want to play through it again right now. And let me put it this way. I've got a lot of games to play. I've got a shit ton of games to play. If I want to play this game right now again, that's saying something. Hell, even the supposed weaknesses of the game end up being really big strengths when you take a look at it at that 30,000 feet view. For example, many may dock a couple of points off the game because sometimes the game doesn't teach you some of the more important details directly. But the thing is, it is about survival, it is about exploration, and the game rewards those players who are paying attention to every aspect of the game. For example, you'll come to learn that your characters can actually be allergic to food in the game, even though the game doesn't outright telling you. For me, this particularly happened in a very, very difficult dungeon that I was having problems with, and I ended up feeding Yuma a buttered potato. She's allergic to potatoes. She died. I only had 3 characters at that point, and the panic set in. Now you probably are saying, well, yeah, that would frustrate me if I didn't know people were allergic to things, but the game told me, just not in the more traditional way. I went back and looked at my footage, and when I was cooking things at camp, Yuma was cooking a potato. She does say an audio line, specifically saying that this would kill her. And that little detail would have given me all I needed to know. Every little thing in this game, whether it be the smallest voice line, does play a difference in the gameplay in some way. That, my friends, that is a great game. There is a caveat to that, however. See, if you happen to miss an explanation for something that is explicitly spelled out in a tutorial, sometimes it's not that easy to find that information. Remember how I mentioned the presence of healing Cleone in the game early in this section? Well, I don't know how to actually activate them, at least at the time I was playing the game. Now, I did eventually figure it out during making this review. I actually looked around trying to figure out what I missed, and then realized my mistake of not actually targeting the character itself. That could have changed things, but it is a bit annoying that there wasn't a place to get that information again in some kind of sub-menu. I get the game wants to figure things out on your own, but at the same time, people do forget things, especially if you take a week off or so. The only other thing I will say negatively, which seems to be fixed in the new Game Plus mode, is that the points to resurrect your character seem to be a little bit too lenient in the first playthrough. I only had one big situation where a character was dead and I didn't have the points to actually resurrect them. And I feel like that could have really been more interesting in the long run, where you had to make character decisions if it had a small increase in cost to it. On the flip side, I was doing a lot of grinding in the game, and that could have been sort of offset by that. Speaking of which, let's talk about that grinding. When it comes to the actual grind of beating the game, I did not find the game having that much grind. Sure, if you want that extra weapon though, you will be grinding a lot, and that has to do with the way the world is set up. What I like about Zanki Zero's setup is that materials are used from all sections of the game, even the first ruin. And even endgame items need those items in question, so you'll sometimes have to go back to find a laundry pole in a school, or a specific mushroom from a particular garden. Granted, you don't really get an indication in terms of in-game of where these items are, and of course you'll be Googling where they are, but some of them make sense of where they should be. Okay, I need to get a specific laundry pole. It's probably not in, I don't know, the woods, or it's probably not in the hot springs. Probably maybe in the school, or maybe in a residential area. Overall, the gameplay of Zanki Zero is top-notch in the genre, and what had me enjoying the long time I put into the game. The frustration factor was the right kind of frustration pushing me forward, but never feeling out of reach in terms of getting to the next part. I loved it, and I'm willing to talk more about it, but considering that this review is a little bit long to begin with, go to the Discord and I'll talk about it even more there. Alright, moving on. Let me talk a little bit about the game's presentation, and focus on the 3D gameplay section first. There's definitely an improvement over their last action work in Ultra Despair Girls, as several of the textures at 4K are a bit better in that game. Granted, anyone who really needs the latest and greatest graphical techniques isn't going to be impressed here, but the game does take advantage of the apocalypse setting while showing broken buildings, letting the destruction of the world being told via environmental storytelling. There's a lot of small details built into the walls of each of the different ruins, being able to see book formations on a former writer's desk, or a torn down poster. There's a good consistency throughout the levels in terms of the damage each of the environments shows, but it did it in different ways so that you didn't get bored throughout the game. However, there's this weird inconsistency in-game regarding texture quality. Take this hallway for example. Compare the ground's texture quality to the walls. First instinct is that the walls is a bit better, yes? The thing is that the wall and the floor textures can look better in certain areas here, but it's almost like it loads a worse texture if it's having problems or something. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I know that they've got better textures down the road here, but for some reason this area in particular has a problem. Even with things that I think the game was going to emphasize, like for example that tree. Okay, yeah, the tree coming out, you'd want to emphasize that and maybe give it a better texture, so I could understand that. But then let's go to another place and look at the safe. I mean, the safe is the thing you interact with. It's the thing that makes the most sense to be the highest texture quality, and this just looks awful compared to everything else. It doesn't look like it's worn, it looks like it is from a game from like 2008. I don't understand why there was such a big inconsistency from level to level and within levels themselves. I don't know whether or not it was the loading process, maybe it chose a lower quality, or whether or not they just didn't have certain textures that were for specific areas. It's a little bit confusing to say the least. I will say that the game at least keeps the quality on the actual enemy models that you come across, and I do love the mixture of regular creatures such as goats and hummingbirds, to giant enemy chickens and crabs that use microwaves as their shells as your enemies. These models do things smartly, letting the model and the outline of the creature take center stage so you can always identify them from a distance, but giving you some real detail like the scales on this two-part colored lizard if you get close enough. Character models, however, had somewhere between an anime and realistic element to them. Many of them were simple but effective in showing off characters' simple emotional states and their most basic attributes. But those who love the designs of Danganronpa characters will be disappointed here, as this game is definitely more down to earth and normal compared to those designs. Granted, they are right for the setting and for the game in place, however. You see a lot of them in visual novel-like cutscenes, where some motion is added to the characters, and I do appreciate the game attempting to make the actual story elements a little more interactive looking compared to past games. I did like certain reactions, like Rio's over-the-top shocked one, but I do wish there was a little bit more detail here, and especially in the variety in the long run for those scripted animations. It felt like in certain scenes that a particular reaction was shoehorned in to fit, and it just didn't work for the overall emotional state that the game was going for. That was not the case for the Extend TV sections, which will remind a lot of people of the Danganronpa games, especially in some of the solid color use and drawing style. These are the best presented elements of the game in their simplicity. They let the story be told on such a simple level, but lets your imagination fill in the black. And I love the small details that were almost doll-like, with characters shaking in place to indicate them talking. There are several moments in the game that also have hand-drawn and more 2D elements as well, and I really do love the artwork and the art style here. and there's a great range of them, even though I did want more by the time the game was done. Okay, maybe not that much more. The UI is fantastic, however. Information is simply presented, but easily seen even in the heat of battle, and the use of colors and things like status effects makes them pop out compared to the characters' portraits here. Everything feels so clean and easy to see, and those UI elements that pop up on things like charge attacks feel powerful and yet useful. There is one thing though that I really have to call out, because it bothered me all game long. The items and weapon icons. I really don't like the fact that they are so low of a resolution, and I feel that was sort of done on purpose to try to resurrect old feelings of old dungeon crawlers. With that said, it got in the way at times, especially in situations like pork versus monkey meat, as it wasn't always obvious which one was which, and it just looks so out of place. As for sound design, this may be the unsung hero of Zanki Zero, as it resonates with the gameplay so well that I definitely felt it when I turned the sound off for my testing. I was dying left and right, and that's because I was so reliant on that sound design. Every little thing gives you information, whether it be hearing the footsteps of an enemy giving you a clue that they are around a corner, or hearing as you just step out of an enemy attack that your last light attack smacked the enemy. Sound design here is powerful and pointed, and it needs to be for the type of game that this is. Now, with that said, those who are hearing impaired, I can't say that the game does a lot for you in that regard. Again, some of that sound design is part of the actual gameplay structure, and I can understand some struggles in terms of how they would design the combat to have those elements without having a sound element to it. So, if you do have sound issues in terms of hearing, you may struggle with this game. But it's more than just that. It's the flair of picking up an item that sticks with you. It's the movement of an UI element that has a ting that is aesthetically pleasing. Everything about this sound design invokes emotion in the right ways, whether it be a shock when you're paralyzed or a smack of a Kione attack. I could sit here and talk about it all day, but listen for yourself and hear what I'm talking about.
They won't get away. Waiting for my They won't get away. What are you doing?
I can't go there. What's this? Got it! I'll take it!
Watch out.
They're blue, Cleone!
Next, the music. This one is quite interesting. Listening to the music outside a game, I was able to hear a lot of the detail that defines what I'd consider to be an excellent soundtrack, including the main theme. It's just under the Danganronpa theme for me, but not by much. And the rest of the music has a great use of string instruments along with woodwind instruments for the island and survival setting. Some of the idle music is very catchy with its upbeat nature, and the more sinister music does give feelings of dread, so again, it matches the emotional tone of the game. So what's the problem? Well, it's the oomph of the stage music when it comes to combat. Now, the boss theme definitely has a boss battle tone to it, but outside of that, the music falls short for where you're going to spend 66% of your game in because, well, when you enter combat, there's no real change in its tone. It's just the level's music. And sometimes the music doesn't necessarily fit some of the elements of the ruins that you're on. The Hot Springs level in particular stood out to me because, well, it just didn't seem right for what kind of scenario and what kind of place you were in. Now, there is a music player in-game to play whatever music you want at any time, but to be quite honest, I feel like that was a sort of hack solution so that people didn't notice the lack of oomph on the music design. So, overall, great quality, but questionable implementation. Come hear what I'm talking about. Finally, the voice acting, and oh boy, I'm gonna get shit over this one, despite my trying to stay objective as possible. In my opinion, the English voice acting outshines the Japanese voice acting by a mile. Now, don't get me wrong, both sets of performances in terms of emotion, in terms of being close to the characters' personalities for the most part, are done well. However, what bothers me somewhat is the range of the characters' ages in the Japanese voice performances, in particular with the male characters. Cutscenes can happen in different age ranges here due to the aging mechanic, and the differences between the Japanese voices don't sound as defined with those ages as in the English ones in my opinion. I expect a kid to have a certain voice level, and I expect a senior to have a certain voice level. In addition, there are some weird casting decisions regarding the tone for certain characters in the Japanese version. Mamoru has a higher pitched voice in the Japanese version that just doesn't seem to match the character in question. Yes, I understand that the bodybuilder persona may have some higher pitched voices in Japanese culture, but for that character in particular and his personality, you sort of need that deep voice for the love sections to make it really stand out. And, well, it just doesn't in the Japanese version, while the English one works pretty darn well. Now, I use the English voices for most of the game, and I love the consistency within the characters, like Yuma's monotone voice almost hinting boredom at times, while Zen's sarcastic and feisty nature coming out even in the smallest parts. Characters back and forths did well to work off each other too, feeling like actual conversations as opposed to just said line dialogue. But in the end, listen to the voices in both Japanese and in English and see what you think of them.
酒を飲みながら仕事の愚痴や新しくできた家族の話なんかをしていたかもしれない。
確かに狩りの話や水の心配をしているなんて普通だったらありえないね。
なのに今は普通じゃないことが日常だ。そう考えたら不思議な感じがしてさ。ごめん。せっかくの酒の席なのになんだか変な空気にしちゃって。
でも日暮さんの言っていることもよくわかります。お酒飲んで吐き出すのもたまにはええと思うで。
中年のぼやきも俺たちにとっては貴重な酒の魚だよ。
中年ってまあ見た目はそうか。
今日のところは飲み明かそうぜ。すぐになくなりそうだけどな。
僕は一応を守る。これでも医者なんだ。
まさか。
いや
私は真白ユマ、暗算型の尻を持つ女。どう？
Hot springs are the best.
Right? Aren't you glad we got in here?
You're right. It feels like all the fatigue is seeping out of my body. But
This is bliss.
I can feel them staring. Maybe we should have bathed separately.
Really? But real sick friends always hang out naked at the bath together.
Now, hold on, Satches. Don't make it sound like I tried to trick you.
Do not try talking your way out of this. Ah! One of the trees grabbed Yuma!
Looks like her foot got caught in one of these tangled vines.
How is it even possible to get tangled up like that?
Nature kicks ass! I'm getting a natural high.
Okay, I'll bite. What are you talking about?
Just look at this. My brain's overflowing with dopamine, appreciating such sheer beauty. Just a few minor adjustments, and this'll be the masterpiece of the century for sure.
No, you're drooling.
So, what do rich people talk about at parties?
Maybe things like vintage wines?
They probably talk about stuff like stock prices too.
Well, my colleagues, this year's stocks are ripening nicely, no?
Close, but not quite, I think.
While it stumbled the most in the presentation section, Zanki Zero still has some great voice acting, some great music, and some fantastic sound design, and some good visuals. It's just that when it missteps, it's really, really noticeable. Granted, it is sort of coming off the heels of something like Danganronpa V3, and I felt like the presentation in that was fantastic. So, with the focus on gameplay, yeah, I can understand why it would take a little bit of a step back, and it's not like it's bad. It just could be improved in certain parts. Finally, let me talk about the technical aspects of the game. During my 90 plus hours of gameplay, I didn't experience a crash, and quite frankly, I don't remember a bug of any significance. In that much time, that's quite impressive, and I don't remember seeing any performance issues with the game either. With that said, it's not exactly a game that's pushing the spec limits at all. As a 5-year-old PC, could run the game at ultra just fine. Load times aren't seemingly a problem either, as it's mostly on par with other games of similar size and structure, and quite frankly, the load times are between parts of the dungeon and going back to your home base, so they are in places that you would expect them. Now, I have seen people have problems in terms of the initial loading of the game at times, and if you do, look at the 3D settings in your NVIDIA card if you're on the PC. Again, I didn't experience any problems, but it is my job to go through and see if anybody else did, and I did notice that a couple people said that it was performing even in the low 30s for the FPS for them, which was nowhere near what I was getting. With my specs, which you can see on screen here, you can see some of the samples of the FPS I was getting for the game. And, well, it speaks for itself. No really big problems here, at least in my mind. As for options, you get some typical sound sliders, and some gameplay options regarding automating switching your attack partners and camera controls. Now, the attack partners one in particular is good to keep on. I know that a lot of people want the control in terms of being able to individually touch people, but I like the fact that this is auto set from the beginning because it does really make a difference in terms of getting attack after attack after attack right away. The PC itself for the keyboard has 2 control schemes, which is actually disappointing that there isn't bindable keys, especially when it could have been useful with some of the weird choices in the keys. I hate when a game forces me to use the tab key, and the tab key makes a huge difference in this game. Now, something that I'm not a fan of, however, is having a separate launcher for options for the graphical options. Yes, it's nice to have up to 4K resolution in these options, borderless, full screen, and windowed options, along with FXAA, bloom, depth of field, and shadow maps. But the fact that it is outside the game, and the fact that this continues on from other games in Spike Chunsoft's library, I just wish that they would put all of them in the same place. Yes, I understand it's easier to set the graphics and the options before the game launches in this launcher, but the fact is that if you are trying to get the most out of performance and you're trying to get the most out of your game, having to keep on closing the game and having to keep on getting out of there, yeah, that sucks. I would have also liked to see more emphasis on texture quality, as I mentioned in the presentation portion of this review, but I will take what I can get, especially from a studio that isn't exactly known for graphical fidelity. Overall, there's not much to say about the technical aspects of the game other than it's solid for what the game needs it to be. Yes, there is some problems with the actual graphic textures, as I mentioned in the presentation. Yes, I would like to see the launcher and the options within the game combined. And yes, I would have liked to see bindable keys. But for the game itself, it does run well, at least for my PC. But of course, go out there and look for your PC and your specs and see if anyone else has similar specs to you, just in case. In the end, was Zanki Zero on par with Danganronpa games for me? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. The strong characterization of the series of Danganronpa is still present in the DNA of Zanki Zero, with powerful individual moments and good character interactions, along with some great twists. The dungeon crawling is some of the best I've played in a while, and the game is something I could see myself replaying in the New Game Plus mode and actually 100% completing. Even though the game was long, it didn't feel artificially stretched, and I even enjoyed elements of grinding for equipment in the game, despite not knowing what I was doing at all times. Now, the game is not for everyone. You have to be patient, and the game will show you a lot if you are paying attention. However, there are hiccups as the game's story does stumble toward the end, and the game is definitely one that certain types of players are going to hate, and you're going to have frustration when you go into a dungeon and all of a sudden get killed in a situation where you don't feel like the game really prepared you. Nevertheless, the game sets out what it claimed it was going to do, and that's why my score is a 94 out of 100, making it a must-buy unless you're hurting for cash. But that doesn't include my enhancer system, which takes the more subjective elements of games and puts them in score modifiers to try to match the game to you. If you strongly fall into one of the following categories, add or subtract that score to the main score. If the first digit of your score changes, then refer to this chart on the screen to find where the game lies for you on the buyability range. As you can see, the game will definitely be decisive for certain types of players with the negative enhancers here, as those without any patience, for example, will hate this game. And that's why I have this system. It is a great game for people that want to experience the patient type of combat, and it does everything that it sets out to do right, but that doesn't mean the game is for you, and in fact, could be completely off your radar because of the fact that, well, it just isn't your type of game. If you made it this far into the video, I really do thank you. I understand this is a long review, and not many people are going to want to watch a 50-minute, 1 hour, 10-minute review on a video game. But because the game came out, a couple of months ago, and there was so much detail I really wanted to cover, I felt it was appropriate for this type of game. And it is in line with my other RPG work on this channel. As to what's next, I promised after what happened with the Stray Cat review that I'd do a review on Seabed to make up for it, so I will probably start on that. However, I want to make something clear. Over the next month and a half or 2 months, I will be working on a new review format. It's not that this review format is going away in any form, but as you've seen with the indie investigation streams on this channel, I do want to cover more games, and I really think I've centered in on a way of doing that in terms of a timely review, but not only that, one that does capture the essence of what I want to capture in a review in terms of matching games with gamers. It does need a little bit refinement, hence the month, 2 month time frame, but I think you guys will appreciate the creative nature of it. And of course, I'm still doing the job searching down in Tampa for, a job down there. So anybody who has a software engineering job down in the Tampa, Orlando area, give me a call, will ya? Anyway, this is Dragnix signing out, and as always, keep on gaming.